Well, fry the cookie dough or fry the cookie?
Fry the cookie dough. So
Okay, that's better.
Yeah.
No. No, Michael!
I don't bake, I just make hot food.
Hot food. Hi, I'm Erica from the Pancake Princess, and today's bake-off is oatmeal chocolate chip cookies, which I feel like needs no introduction, so let's get into it. This first recipe is by Quaker, and as a note, I do not have any cookies in front of me currently because we shot this whole video and we had some great footage, and then the footage accidentally got deleted, so we're redoing this without the cookies, but we still have the B-roll. Anyway, this recipe is by Quaker, which is from the lid on a canister of Quaker oats. There is an older version that apparently some people prefer, but that one was even more similar to Nestle, so I chose to use the current recipe iteration on the lids that like everyone is probably using. It's a fairly similar recipe to Nestle, but it uses slightly less butter, brown sugar, flour, but more oats, and it calls for optional salt, but I chose to include it. This cookie was on the smaller side. It is a little bit drier, not quite as sweet as Nestle, definitely a little puffier and chewier from the higher ratio of oats. Overall, I felt like it was a very standard oatmeal cookie, like no real complaints, but it also didn't blow my mind. So if you want just kind of like an airy, chewy, oaty, not too sweet cookie, I feel like Quaker is the cookie for you. This recipe is by Kroll's Korner. These are super thick and cakey cookies, kind of in the style of Levain. So there was nearly half the butter and sugar ratio to the same flour and oat amount as in the Nestle recipe. This was the only recipe to use some cake flour, the only recipe to use milk chocolate chips instead of semi-sweet. It was one of the recipes that used an egg yolk in addition to a whole egg. And it had the highest bake time of 400 degrees, and I formed the balls into 6-ounce portions, so they were definitely the biggest of all the cookies we tried. So I loved the texture of these cookies. I am a sucker for like a gooey center and a really thick and cakey texture overall, and they had like a nice crisp exterior. I would say that there are so many chocolate chips that the sweetness of the milk chocolate kind of overpowers the flavor of the dough itself, so I can't really speak to like how flavorful the dough itself was, but I liked the texture and the chew that you get from the oats in the cookie overall. I think next time I would make it with semi-sweet because I thought the milk chocolate was just like a little sweet for me, but overall amazing cookie, especially if you like the thick and gooey style. This recipe is by Taste of Home. This was actually a last-minute addition thanks to a recipe that Nicole sent me on Instagram. This recipe was super unique in that it calls for browning butter, toasting the oats in butter, and then you kind of like let them stand to let the oats absorb the butter before mixing everything into the normal batter. So it was actually a super simple recipe, only 8 ingredients aside from like the whole browning the butter and toasting the oats thing. So I was super curious to see how it would taste. Okay, so Taste of Home was really delicious in like the very toasty, buttery, nutty flavor of the cookie. I feel like you got a lot of the brown butter. The oats were very toasty. They almost felt like they were more chewy because the oats were toasted in the butter, so you get like even more texture. But I had a lot of problems in terms of the cookies spreading quite a bit, so I did try refrigerating about half of the batch, and that helped with the spread a little bit. I made an extra batch of these cookies just to make sure that I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I still think that with refrigerating the dough, it helped reduce the spread slightly, but they still spread and looked kind of overcooked. So to combat this, next time I would try browning the butter in a skillet versus a saucepan, because a saucepan doesn't give you as much surface area to let the water evaporate. And so if you have more water evaporating as the butter is browning, that will lead to less spread in your cookies and hopefully make them look less burned than mine. But overall, great flavor. Just thought the texture was a little crispy. This recipe is by Displaced Housewife. This is the only vegan and gluten-free recipe that I included in this bake-off. It is vegan in that it uses earth balance and vegetable oil instead of butter. For the dry ingredients, instead of all-purpose flour, it uses oat flour made from ground oats and tapioca flour. It also uses a generous amount of cinnamon and nutmeg, and it offers an optional chill, which I chose to do. So I really wanted to like this cookie, but unfortunately, every time I include a vegan or gluten-free baked good in a bake-off with more conventional baked goods, they tend to not do so well, and that was the case with this cookie. This cookie spread a ton after it was baked despite chilling the dough, and it kind of reminded me of the texture of like a lace cookie, except it was like also very soft and bendy in the middle and like very hard to get off the pan. Flavor-wise, there was a lot of cinnamon and nutmeg, and I don't personally really love like the combination of cinnamon and nutmeg plus chocolate in a cookie. So overall, some people did love the spice combination, but I think most people wanted a little more structural integrity of the cookie and did not prefer this flavor combination. This recipe is by Half Baked Harvest. It is very similar to Nestle, my benchmark recipe, but it uses all canola oil instead of butter. And it was probably the easiest recipe of all of these recipes because you just dump everything in a bowl, mix it, and it's ready to go. Overall, I love the texture of this cookie. It was one of my favorites in terms of being kind of smaller, but like very thick. I think flavor-wise, obviously, it's somewhat similar to Nestle, but you don't get that really buttery aftertaste because it doesn't have any butter in it. So the flavor is somewhat just like sweet and just like kind of a standard oatmeal chocolate chip cookie. But I personally think that the ease of making this cookie kind of outweighs the like slight lack of flavor. So if you're looking to make cookies in a hurry, I think this is a really awesome choice that is just like super easy to throw together and tastes pretty great. This recipe is by Nestle Toll House, and this is the recipe that is most widely duplicated across the internet. It seems like a lot of people use this recipe as kind of like the jumping off point to recipes that they develop or will honestly just imitate it because it's a great cookie recipe. Overall, I thought this cookie was going to be almost indistinguishable to the Quaker cookie because the recipes are so similar, but Nestle was actually quite a bit flatter than Quaker. I think the flavor of the butter is much more present in the Nestle cookie. Like you get that buttery flavor really coming through. I think you get nice hits of salt, but to me, I prefer the thicker texture of the Quaker cookie. So, I mean, obviously lots of people are making the Nestle cookie. It's a very popular recipe for a reason because I think it's really like that classic nostalgic oatmeal cookie that people picture. But in my mind, I think there are some ways that you could improve it. This recipe is reportedly by Hillary Clinton as specified by All Recipes and the New York Times. And this recipe is kind of like a mashup between Nestle and Quaker, like very similar ratios, but it uses all shortening instead of butter. So I know a lot of you don't like baking with shortening, and I fully expected to not like this cookie, but there was something so great about the texture in terms of the crispiness. So it was airy in the same way that Quaker and Nestle kind of have an airy quality to the cookie, but there was also this like ethereally crispy layer on the outside of the cookie. And in the same way that I didn't really miss the super buttery flavor from Half Baked Harvest, I felt the same way about this cookie. So even though it doesn't have any butter, I feel like you still get kind of like that classic oatmeal chocolate chip flavor from sugar and the chocolate and the oats. So overall, I think if you're looking for like a really crispy cookie, this is the cookie that I would recommend. This recipe is by Broma Bakery, and it stood out because it uses brown butter, it uses 1 egg yolk in addition to a whole egg, it calls for an overnight chill, and it also uses a relatively low ratio of oats. This cookie had an incredible fudgy texture while still managing to be like a relatively thin cookie as opposed to Kroll's, which is like a very thick and gooey style cookie. So loved the fudginess of this cookie, gooey center, amazing. The flavor was also extremely buttery, almost verging on too buttery. But overall, people seem to love both the flavor and the texture of this cookie. If there were any complaints, it was that maybe it wasn't like a classic, like what you would think of as an oatmeal chocolate chip cookie because there aren't that many oats in it. But it would be like an incredible chocolate chip cookie, and I still think it was a really great oatmeal chocolate chip cookie if you're looking for that gooey center, that really like fudgy texture, and plenty of butter flavor. This recipe is by Buttermilk by Sam, and I chose her recipe because she was the only recipe to use all egg yolks, no whole eggs. She was also the only recipe to use quick oats rather than rolled old-fashioned oats, and she had a ratio of twice the amount of oats to flour by volume. Okay, so along with Half Baked Harvest, this was one of my favorite cookies in terms of being like kind of a thick, chunky cookie. I really liked the texture that the quick oats gave to this cookie because they kind of like melted into the batter, but still gave like great chew and like heft to the cookie. Sam did note that in her recipe she calls for chopped chocolate, so you'll see the photos on her website. Her cookies look much more spread out versus mine are like quite a bit thicker. and that is because I use chocolate chips, which tend to spread less than chopped chocolate. But overall, in terms of flavor, I felt like these cookies had the best salt balance. You really got like those after hits of salt. The flavor was really buttery. The texture is like nice and thick and chewy. So overall, if you want like a thick and chewy cookie with great flavor, I would choose Sam's. This recipe is by Bravetart, and as usual, she uses some unusual ingredients in her recipe, such as oat flour, steel cut oats in addition to old-fashioned rolled oats. Note that I did make an exception for this recipe. I think she uses cranberries and pecans in her original recipe, and I subbed in chocolate chips, again, to be consistent. And a note that I used commercial oat flours from Bob's Red Mill because that's what Stella specifies versus making homemade oat flour as in the Displaced Housewife recipe. So let's see how it tastes. Okay, to me, this cookie had amazing flavor. Like you get a lot of like buttery flavor. It tastes very caramelized, kind of similar to Broma Bakery, but it was very thin and the structural integrity wasn't quite there. It was kind of hard to get them off the cookie sheet. And I would say that the steel cut oats, I don't think added a ton of chewiness, whereas compared to the other recipes that just used old-fashioned oats. So I don't think it was really worth buying a whole canister of steel cut oats for this recipe. If I made them again, I'd probably just use regular old-fashioned. Overall, love the flavor. I would probably tweak this recipe to fit my own preferences, which is a little bit of a thicker cookie. This recipe is by Smitten Kitchen. It is very similar to the Quaker ratio, but it uses whole wheat flour, turbinado sugar, and then I think you can use wheat germ or a number of other things, but I chose to use wheat germ. So this was another one of like the nicely thick and chewy cookies, kind of similar texturally to Buttermilk by Sam. I really liked the chew in this cookie and the heft. I think flavor-wise, you kind of get like a heartiness from the whole wheat flour, but it's not super in your face as like whole grain. Some people did not love the crunch that you get from the turbinado sugar that is in the dough. I personally didn't mind it. I thought it added some nice texture. And I think the wheat germ really added some great flavor as well, but I am a wheat germ stan. So overall, some people thought there was almost like too much chocolate in this cookie, but I liked it. I think this is a great option if you're looking, again, for like a thick and chewy cookie and you want it to be a little more wholesome. This recipe is by Doubletree. It was highly requested. It uses a similar butter and sugar ratio to Quaker and Nestle, but uses half a cup more flour, fewer oats, and more chocolate chips. So this cookie is very flat, very buttery and crunchy. Some people compared it to like a grocery store texture, but I thought that this was a really nicely crisp cookie all the way through. The middle was like a little chewier, but definitely not gooey. The flavor is very buttery. I would say the main complaint about this cookie is that it didn't really taste like an oatmeal cookie. So once again, like Broma, like an excellent chocolate chip cookie, maybe not what you would think of as like a classic oatmeal chocolate chip cookie, but still very tasty. So I guess if you like don't really want a lot of oats in your cookie, this would be a great one, but also for anyone who likes a thin and crispy cookie. Okay, in terms of my favorite oatmeal chocolate chip cookie, I have several favorites as usual. So Kroll's Korner is my favorite in terms of being like a thick and gooey texture. I would say that Buttermilk by Sam, Half Baked Harvest, and Smitten Kitchen are all great for a slightly more conventional oatmeal chocolate chip cookie that still has like a thick and chewy texture. I think that flavor-wise, Broma Bakery for that brown butter, Taste of Home for that super caramelized, toasty, like, I guess it also has brown butter. Bravetart was my other favorite. Flavor-wise, those cookies are just like a little bit flatter, of course, varying textures. But overall, I feel like you can't really go wrong. I feel like I say that every time, but this batch of cookies was like pretty solid. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what bake-off you'd like to see next. For more content, you can visit my blog at thepancakeprincess.com or my Instagram at thepancakeprincess, and see you next time.